So I've recently seen a little well, not a clip, but the whole interview between Alastair Campbell and another lady on a talk show. They're of course furiously debating the issue of Brexit. I've heard of such a thing, and then not coming to any sensible outcome whatsoever. What I'm going to explain here is that Alastair Campbell made a very extraordinary claim. He claimed that all EU legislation had some kind of quality of being inferior to domestic legislation, domestic law within the UK, in that Britain had somehow okayed all of this law, and that had gone through each law systematically and checked, do we want this, do we want that, and had the freedom to throw out EU law that it didn't like. This is actually completely wrong. This is utterly wrong. There's no constitutional mechanism either in Britain or in the EU where states have a right of veto to any new legislation applied onto them. What you have to grasp is that membership to the European Union, from the British point of view, involved us delegating large amounts of our sovereignty out to a foreign institution, foreign corporation called the European Union. It's the way I think of it. It's a bit like imagine you own a car and you hand the keys to someone and say, right, there you go, there's my car, do what thou wilt. And they take your car and they drive around and they do whatever they like with it. On paper, it's still your car. All the documents say it's your car. But in reality, the control of the car belongs to the person you gave the key to. And all the Brexit process has been is just getting the car keys back. That's all it's been, or attempted to have been. Now, what Alastair Campbell doesn't know is that in the 1980s, Parliament legislated not once, but twice against EU law in both the Weights and Measures Act 1985, and the Merchant Shipping Act 1988. Both of the provisions in these statutes were contrary to EU law. People were taken to court for breaching EU law, and the court, domestic courts, UK courts, found that the EU law was superior to the domestic law. So the Weights and Measures Act, this was another famous case of Thoburn and Sunderland. Yeah, Sunderland Council. These were street sellers in markets that were selling their fruit and veg using the imperial system, pounds and ounces, but EU law said it all had to be metric. Their defence was that the Weights and Measures Act said it was legal to do this. The prosecution said, no, it isn't legal to do this because the EU law is superior to domestic law. So Parliament tried twice to legislate against EU law and failed. Okay? The reason why it failed is because EU law, when you're a member of the European Union, is superior to your own law. It's that simple. Now, the doctrine of the supremacy of EU law did not really exist in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 70s when we joined up. What happened is that as countries joined the European Union, they signed up to recognize the jurisdiction and jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice in its verdict over issues of EU law. The European Court of Justice was presented with cases, a series of cases where there was a conflict between domestic law and EU law, and that court developed a series of cases and a doctrine that said EU law is superior to domestic law. When the UK joined, we also agreed to sign up to the ECJ and recognise the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, meaning that we had signed up to any rules and doctrines and concepts that it made, including the supremacy of EU law. So, the idea that Parliament could just do what it liked and had any kind of power to overwrite EU law is false. In factotame, the conclusions were that the court would only recognise the amendment or abolition of EU law by the UK Parliament if the abolition or amendment was clearly worded in the statute. If there was any ambiguity, EU law would take precedence. It's a complex case, but they came to the conclusion that EU law was essentially superior law and could not be whittled away via accidental implied repeal. It could only be removed by express repeal. Parliament could have done this, but for political reasons, it chose not to. And we've seen that with countries that have allegedly violated EU rules, like Poland and Hungary and probably a few others. They all get bullied and threatened. So, he's plain wrong. He's just plain wrong. Parliament had no significant power to easily remove EU law, and it certainly didn't check it. And if it had, there was a very high burden placed upon it to remove EU law. And it didn't, for political reasons. So there. I'm quite embarrassed for him, actually. Anybody who knows anything about the European Union and our membership to it knows that EU law was superior to domestic law. And every time domestic law conflicted with EU law won. Because the European Court of Justice said so, and we'd signed up to its verdicts. It's that simple.